Well, the American auto companies certainly made a number of excellent V8s available to the public in the 20th century. And one of those great V8s was the Cadillac big block engine. It was introduced in 1968 at 472 cubic inches. When it was introduced in 1968, the 472 replaced Cadillac's 429 cubic inch engine that was introduced in the 1964 model year. However, by 1968, the 429 had been surpassed in terms of displacement by both Chrysler's 440 as well as Lincoln's 462 and 460 cubic inch engines, and Cadillac wanted something that was bigger. The old 429 that had evolved from the 390 cubic inch V8 before it, and even the 331 cubic inch V8 before that, simply could not get any larger. Thus, the 472 was birthed. At introduction, the engine produced 375 gross horsepower and 525 pound-feet of torque. And it was a bit over square in design, with the bore being 4.3 inches versus a stroke of 4.06 inches. In other words, the bore was slightly bigger than the stroke. Compression ratio was a healthy 10.5 to 1. Cadillac not only touted this V8 in terms of increased displacement as well as power, but also informed the public that this engine had been extensively redesigned to reduce maintenance and used about 10% fewer parts and 25% fewer gaskets as the 429 cubic inch engine that it replaced. Moreover, in thinking ahead during this time period of relatively cheap gasoline, Cadillac ensured that the 472 could be made larger relatively easily. This advantage was exploited not too many years later in 1970 when the 472 would be enlarged to 500 cubic inches for use exclusively in the Cadillac Eldorado. In the 1970 Eldorado, the Cadillac 500 cubic inch V8 made a then whopping 400 gross horsepower, Cadillac's highest horsepower engine to date. It also produced 550 pound-feet of torque and had a even bore and stroke dimensions, both at 4.3 inches. Compression ratio remained a healthy 10 to 1, down slightly from the 1968 and 69 472 cubic inch engines, but still quite lofty. In 1971, General Motors' top leadership mandated that the entire company's engines had to operate on no-lead regular fuel. Thus, compression ratios were dropped on the 472 and 500 engines from 10 to 1 to 8.5 to 1, as doing this helped prevent spark knock and detonation while using no-lead regular fuel. Even Corvettes during this time period had to adhere to this corporate edict. Thus began the mighty 472 and 500's horsepower decline, with the 472 dropping in horsepower from 375 to 345 gross horsepower in 1971, and the 500 dropping from 400 gross horsepower to 365 gross horsepower. It was still a relatively healthy number, but as the horsepower came down and the vehicle curb weights went up, with Cadillac's new introduction of the 1971 DeVille, Fleetwood, and Eldorado models, it wasn't a winning combination for overall horsepower to weight ratios and acceleration. In 1972, auto companies began measuring horsepower with SAE net ratings, which included all the accessories on the car as well as an exhaust system and air cleaner. It was a much more accurate representation of horsepower, and it's still the measure that's used today. As a consequence, reported horsepower ratings for the 472 engine dropped to 220 horsepower, and for the 500 cubic inch V8 down to 235 horsepower. They would remain at that level in 1973 before dropping in 1974 to 205 horsepower for the 472 engine and 210 horsepower for the 500 cubic inch V8. In 1975, the 472 engine was dropped, and the 500 completely powered the Cadillac lineup, with horsepower remaining at 210. Unfortunately, as 1976 hit, the 500's horsepower would drop to an amazingly paltry 190 horsepower in carbureted form, albeit in fuel-injected form, the horsepower was 215. At least the engine produced these figures at a very lazy 3,600 RPM, a function of all the emissions devices that were employed at the time to try to improve the emissions on this old technology engine. In 1977, for the new downsized Cadillacs, a 425 cubic inch version of the previous 472 and 500 was introduced, with a 4.08 inch bore and a 4.06 inch stroke. The engine was about 100 pounds lighter than the 500 cubic inch engine that it replaced, and it made 180 horsepower at 4,000 RPM in carbureted form, 195 horsepower with fuel injection. This engine was used on all Cadillacs through 1979, except the Seville, which used an Oldsmobile V8 engine coupled with electronic fuel injection, as well as 1979 Eldorados, which employed that same Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch V8. In 1980, a smaller 368 cubic inch engine replaced the previous 425 cubic inch engine, and it was arrived at by deboring the 425 from 4.08 inches down to 3.8 inches. This engine made 145 horsepower in carbureted form and 150 horsepower on the Sevilles and Eldorados, where electronic fuel injection was standard. The 368 would represent the last General Motors big block engine, even though its displacement had decreased significantly from the 500 cubic inch mill that it once was. In non-limousine passenger cars, 1981 would represent the last year for the Cadillac V8, and it went out kind of in a heartbreaking fashion with the V8 6.4 version. This particular version had cylinder deactivation that was co-developed with Eaton Corporation, where the cylinders would deactivate, first going from 8 to 6-cylinder mode in lower low conditions before progressing to 4-cylinder mode in conditions such as highway cruising. The system would reactivate 8 cylinders when more power was needed. To deactivate a cylinder, solenoids mounted to that particular cylinder's rocker arm studs would disengage the fulcrums, allowing the rockers to basically just float and leave the valves closed, despite the push rods continuing to activate. You can readily identify V8 6.4 engines by their rocker arm covers, which have elevated sections over the deactivating cylinders and electrical connectors on the top of it. It was a relatively good idea, as with the valves closed, the cylinders acted as air springs, which helped eliminate the feel of a missing engine, and it also allowed the cylinders to stay warm so that they could instantaneously relight upon reactivation. However, these engines employed throttle body fuel injection, not port fuel injection, and the fuel control would basically be altered when one of these modes was entered, and it would have to alter the entire fuel-air charge across all 8 cylinders versus being able to specifically tailor the shutdown of fuel to cylinders that were deactivated. These digitally fuel-injected cars, as well as those in the 1980s, also had some primitive onboard diagnostics that mechanics could employ, or even the home shade tree mechanic, without having any scan tools. And while it was a great idea with promise that certainly came back decades later when GM's displacement on demand was reintroduced on Chevrolet small block V8s, the technology that was available at the time just wasn't quite robust enough to execute the V8 6.4 programming all that effectively. And in fact, Cadillac ended up issuing 13 different updated PROM chips for the electronic control modules in these vehicles, but it really didn't matter. Many people simply had the modulated displacement function shut off. And at that point, the 368 cubic inch engine was actually quite reliable and relatively peppy still, especially in the smaller cars like the then Eldorado and Seville. So is the Cadillac Big Block V8 the best V8 of all time produced by American automakers during the 20th century? The answer to that, I think, is no. And here's why. The engine was extremely reliable, had tons of torque, and moved many different Cadillacs, often with little fanfare over the years. And in some cases, items like water pumps that typically failed on other General Motors engines like small block Chevrolets of the era, as well as other V8s, really didn't fail on the Cadillac engines. They were quite robust overall. However, if you drive a Cadillac V8 from the era and you drive it and compare it to other General Motors big block engines, you notice a few things. The first of which is that when you step on the accelerator very hard, the car does indeed propel forward with some good speed, especially in the 472 and 500 cubic inch engines that have 10-to-1 or north of that compression ratios pre-1971. However, if you're just driving around town and driving normally, the part throttle tip-in on these V8s really is nothing to write home about, and they feel a little bit boggy even. And some of this is owed due to the intake manifold that was so low profile that the intake air and fuel charge actually had to go up into the cylinders, given the intake and the head design, as opposed to going down into them. Some of it is also just the relatively lean jetting on these, which I suspect is a function of them having some emission control issues. And that is best exemplified by the fact that a number of these Cadillac V8s used air pumps, even in the late 60s, for federal cars, while other General Motors big blocks did not use that. So I think consequently they were jetted relatively lean for part throttle tip-in in order to try to curb emissions. That had the effect of not giving all that great of part throttle tip-in. And lastly, I would say the components that were employed to make these engines were relatively unremarkable. They had cast iron connecting rods, cast iron crankshafts, and overall they really can't rev north of 5,000 RPMs unless you make some major modifications. Now, of course, in luxury cars, that's something that shouldn't necessarily be needed, but even engines such as the Chrysler 440 that powered big vehicles like the Imperials had forged connecting rods, forged crankshafts for many years before eventually switching to something similar to what Cadillac had with cast cranks and cast rods. So overall, how would I rate this Cadillac V8 and what are the pros and cons? I would say they're extremely smooth, durable, and quite reliable in everyday operation. However, they're just not going to have the same scoot and oomph as other General Motors V8s of the period, or Chrysler or Ford V8s, or even the AMC 401. And that's true even if I take into account the curb weights of these Cadillacs, which were definitely hefty, but certainly other vehicles of the era were also quite hefty as well. So all in all, I would say the Cadillac V8 is definitely a good one, smooth, reliable, durable. It's just a relatively unremarkable one. And for that reason, I won't say that it's my favorite or best V8 of the 20th century. Thanks again for watching this video. Till next time, take care. Thanks again for watching this video on the Cadillac V8. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as that helps the YouTube algorithm serve it up to more viewers like you. And until next time, check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.